They had wanted the photograph to do what photographs are supposed to do, fix a family into a single legible thing. The studio smelled of starch and lemon oil, the air cooling under a green lampshade that made the room look like a shallow, domestic sea. My mother fussed with the collar of her blouse until the powdered starch powdered her fingertips. My father adjusted his tie. Noah stood slightly apart, hands folded the way my father taught him at family dinners. Neat, unobtrusive. A photographer I barely knew told us to look at a small mirror to remember the angle of our mouths. The camera clicked. When the photograph came back, it had kept everything the way photographs keep it. The posture, the dress, the same hesitant curl of hair at my mother's temple. It had kept the light from the green lamp, the sunburned patch on my father's cheek. But somewhere in the dark room or in the camera or in weather that we would never fully explain, something had taken hold of the emulsion and run like a bruise through the negative. A smear crossed Noah's face. It was not a tear or a blur from movement. It was a small, hungry absence right where the eyes should be, a horizontal erasure that left his features unreadable. They asked then the question the title asks better than I could have. Is he hiding something? The town asked it in halves and whispers, as towns do. At the bakery, the baker who had once done my mother's hair before the chemist opened, lingered at the counter and watched me take a loaf. "So," she said, the single syllable full of prodding. At Mrs. Keene's bookshop, a copy of the portrait hung near the window for a week. People passed and leaned in, inspecting the smear as a thing of texture. The newspaper columnist, a woman who preferred opinion to fact, framed it as a story about appearances and what they conceal. A journalist from the regional paper called, somewhere between curiosity and the efficient hunger of a beat. He asked whether the smear meant a secret illness, whether papers already hidden might now want air. Rumor is a kind of weather. It gathers on gutters and sills. It grows more certain the longer it sits. People invented plausible explanations the way they invent recipes, a pinch of speculation, a suggestion of malice, the comfortable heat of a narrative that ends in revelation. None of those explanations carried proof. They did not have to. A smear in a photograph asks for a story, and the town obliged. My mother wanted a statement. She drafted sentences like one might lay out a table. Clear plates, no crumbs. "We'll say it was a defect," she announced to the living room, the words arranged like cutlery. "We'll thank them for their understanding." She wanted tidy things because when a photograph warped, inheritance and reputation felt suddenly like loose cloth. My father, who keeps ledgers of his own, small lists of who has paid and who still owes, moved toward containment. He suggested we might retake it, or commission someone from the city to examine the negative, as if there were a specialist for every possible embarrassment. He spoke of petitioning the photographer to retract prints. He spoke of neighbors and church committees. The lawyer, more pragmatist than moralist, drew up options on the kitchen table between the lemon cake crumbs. He spoke of releases and permissions, of options that would forbid reproduction of the image, that would put it in a drawer and hand us the key. He could see the smear as a problem to be solved with clauses. He presented a small stack of paper with lines and spaces that hovered like a bridge we could cross to the other side. Privacy in return for signatures. Legalese is its own kind of ritual, a rite promising closure. Noah listened. He did not argue. He refused spectacle in a way I used to mistake for indifference. He said, when pushed, when my mother insisted on assurance, when the lawyer asked for an answer, only, "I prefer to keep to what I do." Keeping to what you do. It is a phrase like lemon oil on wood. Simple, with a scent that lingers. I had always been trained in performance. I have learned where to laugh, which elbow to rest on at receptions, how to look like someone who holds things together. I knew how to manufacture calm. Noah's refusal to manufacture anything was not theatrical. It was a pulling away, like a hand moving from a hot pot. He went to the study. The study has a green lampshade and a small table lined in grooves and indentations made by years of care. It smells of lemon oil, paper dust, and the faint, austere sweetness of starch where someone irons cloth close by the window. The ledger lives there, a heavy bound thing with a spine thick from years of entries. It is the kind of object that claims weight not only by pages, but by the weight of the acts written within. This ledger is a list of names, neighbors, those who had once borrowed sugar or would need a hand in winter, small obligations and debts that are not legal but moral. Mrs. Halverson's right glove mended, the printer's apprentice owed 2 bindings, the pantry credit to a widow 2 streets over. It was not just a record. It was a practice. Noah's work is not ostentatious. He copies letters the old-fashioned way by hand. He takes someone else's tiny plea, "My rent is late, can you spare flour?" and transcribes it into a language of tending. Then he folds the copy and keeps it in the ledger. When necessary, he burns duplicates. He mends gloves. He writes small, precise notes in the margins. Left at door. Do not ask why. Leave by window. Each action is a kind of liturgy, private and repeated. The steward is the keeper of those liturgies. He is older than Noah by 2 generations, stock still in the way olive trees are steady, and he speaks like someone who has seen how good intentions calcify into entitlement. He taught Noah the difference between keeping a name and owning one. "Names," he said one rainy afternoon, "aren't trophies to be polished. They are things to keep from fraying. You stitch them, you don't display them." He taught us stitches. A small whip stitch to close a seam, a concealed running stitch to hold a page, a way to fold a letter so the wax did not crack. He taught us the ritual of reading, the annual hour when names are spoken aloud and returned. He advised burning duplicate copies after reading as an act of protection and release. "If you do not burn the extra," he warned Noah, "you're keeping possibility, not care. There is a distinction. One insists on endless future leverage, the other on service bound by time." I began to spend afternoons in that study. At first I told myself I was there because I could not bear the gossip any longer, that I preferred the company of things that did not speculate. But the truth was subtler, which is to say it was a truth that accumulates through small acts. I found that watching Noah put lemon oil on the spine of a book, steadying his hands as he pressed glue, a small bright seam of citrus that made paper shimmer, was a kind of apprenticeship in judgment. He did not keep names to use against them. Instead, he turned them into commitments. He copied requests and then acted on them in ways the town did not notice. A pair of gloves left on Mrs. Halverson's chair one morning, a small bundle of flour tucked into the pantry with a note that said only, "For Tuesday." A repaired shoe left at a widow's doorstep. The ledger recorded the exchange, but the exchange itself was its own reward. When people in the market fretted about how the smear might affect our prospects, conversations about foundations and grants for the community center that my parents had spent years trying to secure, Noah refused to go to meetings. He refused interviews. He would send a note instead, a line of neat handwriting on an unremarkable card. "We continue in the spirit of repair," it would say. The town wanted explanation. He offered practice. The foundation representatives came twice. They were pleasant, wearing the kind of certainty that believes structured giving is the answer to unruly human lives. "We want to ensure continuity," they said, their words like a form of insurance. "We would be happy to digitize the ledger," suggested a woman in a navy coat, imagining a tidy archive where names nested in code. The printer's apprentice, young, eager, and unwise, offered to scan the pages for free. "Imagine the preservation," he said, with an engineer's faith in backups. The steward scowled when we mentioned digitization. "Preservation is not preservation if it loses the burn," he said. He worried that turning everything into data would remove the obligation of care. A digital ledger, he argued, allows distance and abstraction. A handwritten copy compels hands and time. The steward called ritual what others called fuss. He insisted on the reading. Once a year, the ledger's names would be spoken in a simple room with chairs pulled close and tea poured into thin cups. The reader had to say the obligations as if they were breathing them. The reading was not for show. It was a renewal. It asked consent again. The town's appetite for spectacle made it harder for my family to hold to that rhythm. My mother feared the annual reading might become a stage. My father feared it might not be enough to satisfy the lawyer. The lawyer wanted binding clauses, signatures, a notation in the will that would make stewardship enforceable by law. The steward countered that law turns relationships into commodities. Consent is not a single line, the steward told us. It is a recommitment, year by year, like tending a garden. You do not plant once and then allow ivy to claim the beds. At social gatherings, the smear continued to do work. People leaned in to examine the portrait that had been printed in the paper for one indecisive week. Some imagined illness, others suspected some personal failing. There was a cruel pleasure, momentary and bright as a coin, in inventing a narrative. When someone needs a story, the mind supplies one, often selecting from the familiar repertoire: betrayal, shame, illness. The absence of visible eyes called for a reason, and reasons are comfortable. Yet in the study, among the lemon oil and the soft hiss of tea, these hypotheses evaporated like steam. When a rumor visits a room of craft, it finds fewer listeners. The seamstress who mends gloves does not care for rumor, she cares for fingers. The ledger does not hold evidence for gossip, it holds receipts for small acts, and the names of those who accepted them. I learned in those days how to fold a letter so the wax would be protected by its own crease. I learned to thread a needle so the knot would not slip. I learned to make an archival-style paste from flour and water that the steward insisted on because it was honest and reversible. If the repair needed to be undone, it could be. We worked with powdered starch to stiffen a collar. We used lemon oil to lubricate the worn leather of the ledger's cover. These were not glamorous tasks. They were daily, repeated, exacting. They required a kind of patience that seemed at first to be a refusal to see the world as the town wanted it to be seen. In the margins of the ledger, I began to see a different story than the one the columnist had printed. Names repeated: Mrs. Halverson, printer's apprentice, Mrs. Keene's nephew. Beside each name, neat marks indicated what had been done: gloves, bread, a placement of a chair near a widow's door. There were notes that read simply, "No public mention," or "Leave at dawn." There were letters transcribed that should have been private but which Noah copied with reverence. He would bring them to the table and show them only in fragments: a plea for rent, a child's goodbye, a request for the return of a photograph. He copied them as if he were making an inventory of need. One afternoon, while rain tapped the window in a thin, steady rhythm, the steward taught me a delicacy of handling paper that felt more like a prayer than an instruction. "You don't rush these things," he said. He showed me how to lift a brittle page with a thin spatula, how to dust it with a soft brush so that the dust did not lodge in the fibers and cause further damage. He told me to imagine the person who had written the letter, to feel the weight of their request, and to match that weight with the steadiness of my own hand. "If you don't let the name be a person," he told me, "you are only dealing with a label." These were small, private ethics. They ran against the town's appetite for tidy narratives. The photograph's smear had started a conversation that wanted loud answers: a visible confession, a scandal, a reason. The ledger insisted on soft ones: steady help, hands that return again and again. Where rumor wanted one lightning revelation, the ledger asked for repetition, hundreds of small acts binding a community. I confess now how easy it was to judge in that first week. I am not proud of the way curiosity leant toward suspicion, as if I were examining the body of a secret to find its disease. We are socially trained to prefer stories that tie cleanly. Villain, motive, payoff. The smeared photograph made that temptation almost irresistible. It offered the bright arc gossip loves. It invited a reveal. The title of our private fever was short. Is he hiding something? Watching Noah return to his work felt at times like a refusal to give the town what it wanted. When Mrs. Keene raised her eyebrows at the bookshop and murmured, "Is he keeping secrets?" I wanted to answer with the ledger's modest list. I wanted to hold up the stack of copied letters like a shield. But the ledger does not speak in the market. It speaks in the quiet rooms, in the careful folding of a letter, in the way a repaired glove fits a hand. The first major burst of public pressure, calls from the columnist, a foundation representative hinting at withdrawn support unless there was clarity, came and went like a storm. We responded in the ways my parents knew. A brief statement, a closed-door meeting, a lawyer recommending a course of action that sounded like locking a window after a bird has flown through. But for Noah, the appropriate response was another sort of silence, not an absence but a different kind of presence, more tending. He doubled down on the ledger. He increased his hours in the study. He began copying letters earlier in the morning, when the lemon oil smelled brightest. And the light through the green shade turned the paper a soft, careful green. There is a time, after an initial commotion, when public interest wanes and private practice resumes its slow claim. That is when small things begin to multiply. A mended glove appears on a doorstep. A loaf of bread shows up in a pantry. A child finds that the shoes she thought would not last through winter now have soles that someone has stitched back with patient cord. These acts do not make the morning news. They don't lead to headlines. They do, however, change who can cross a room without fear. One afternoon, the printer's apprentice, still eager, still convinced that we were living in the age of perfect archives, brought a stack of printed flyers to the shop counter. He suggested printing an account, a public ledger of the good works, all neatly itemized so that donors might see how their money made a difference. "Transparency helps trust," he said, smiling. But the steward folded his hands and shook his head. "Transparency," he replied, "is a display shelf. It makes people proud in a way that needs applause. We're not building a shelf." The printer's apprentice left disappointed. He could not yet see that privacy and careful ritual are sometimes the conditions that make public trust possible. He could not yet see that the ledger's value was not in exhibition, but in rhythm. As I learned to stitch, I began to see my own life reflected in the ledger. I had performed calm for so long that I cultivated distance as an art. The right smile at the right time, the correct note of sympathy in a conversation. But those were once-off performances, theatrical, like a single photograph that pretends to be the full story. The ledger taught me a different ethic. Repetition. To look after someone is to do so repeatedly, unglorified, until the work no longer feels like work, but like a fabric of life. At night, after the day's copying and mending, Noah reads the ledger by lamplight. He does not read aloud. He traces names with his finger and speaks a small, private phrase into the air the way some people say prayers. Sometimes he burns a duplicate letter in a tin and watches the flame take it. We have burnt duplicates in the sink under the tap because the steward insisted on the rawness of the act. What is offered must be offered again in public to be acceptable, but some offerings must be allowed to return to air. The steward argued that burning duplicates protects people from the ledger becoming leverage. Without duplicates, there is no threat of exposure, only care. There was one moment when I thought the ledger might simply be a way to avoid the town's hunger altogether. Noah could have retreated behind a kind of benevolent secrecy and used the ledger as a cloak. He might have guarded information the way someone guards jewels. but his actions always undermined that suspicion. He mended without announcing it. He left notes that invited consent. If this helps, leave a bowl on the step, otherwise ignore. He asked whenever possible before acting. Consent for him was not a legal clause. It was a practice, repeated, invited, and renewed. It occurred to me in a less judgmental hour that the smear did what a loud scandal would not have done. It asked the town to choose between spectacle and quiet tending. When all eyes were on that small absence in the photograph, people wanted a single, tidy answer. The ledger refused to give one. It gave instead 1,000 small confirmations of care: the stitch, the bread left in the pantry, the repaired glove. To the town that wanted a villain, Noah offered only craft. If you are watching this and the title has tugged at you, if the question, "Is he hiding something?" made a quick judgment in your chest, pause for a moment. Have you ever judged someone by one image? Comment yes or no and a short example. After that week of gossip and the brief attention of writers and donors, the study became quieter than it had been in years. The ledger's pages grew thick. Noah began copying not only urgent pleas, but small notes of thanks that had been left anonymously at doors. He transcribed them as if they were the most important documents in the world. He would fold a letter so delicately that the crease read like a conservationist's promise. The steward watched sometimes, and sometimes he offered corrections, a gentler fold here, a different knot there. He told stories in the pauses between instruction, stories about how a name left untended could become a rumor, and how rumor could harden into accusation. He warned that if we did not ritualize consent, the ledger would calcify into obligation. People will ask for contracts, he said, the words thick as molasses. They will want signatures. They will think a signed piece of paper is the same as commitment. He tapped the ledger with a blunt finger. A signature isn't the thing that keeps a person. 1,000 small acts will. We started to test that. A neighbor had a roof leak that made his ceiling into a map of water stains. Noah wrote a small note, nothing formal, and left it under the man's mat with a suggestion to meet at dawn. At 6 a.m., Noah and the steward began tapping shingles. They worked without announcement, without photography, joining the neighbor in a rhythm that meant, "We will help, and we will keep your privacy intact while we do it." The repaired shingles held the winter. The public part of the story, the smear, the column, the calls from foundations, carried a hunger for revelation. The private part, the ledger, had a hunger of its own, to be useful. They are different hungers. One eats stories for breakfast, the other eats small acts. They do not always reconcile easily. It was in one of those early mornings when the light through the green lamp was clear and the tea had been poured twice that Noah showed me a stack of copied letters he had been keeping in secret. He laid them out like a hand presenting seeds. They were small requests, sometimes no more than a line. "My daughter needs a dress," or "There's a hayloft ladder needing repair. Can you help?" He had written the date they were received and the date they were fulfilled. The ledger contained a slow tally of human needs met in private ways. He looked at me, then, with an expression I had not learned to read. "Would you choose me without the ledger?" I asked, because the question had been floating in the air since the photograph. I needed to know whether his private acts were a hedge or a heart. He didn't answer like someone confessing to a secret. He did not perform a dramatic renunciation. He reached for one of the copied letters and pushed it across the table. It was a short note, a child's small wish for warm shoes, and beside it, in Noah's careful hand, was another note. Sown, souls replaced, left with neighbor. That was his answer. Not words, but the evidence of steady action. He chose by doing. That night the house felt different. The town had its recipes for narrative. A smear, a scandal, a reveal. The house had its practices instead. I could feel, in the quiet after the day's small labors, the ledger's weight as a kind of gravity. It held names toward one another. It drew us back into a pattern of tending that would not be satisfied by a single photograph's partial erasure. The next days would be full of more subtle tests. The lawyer continued to draft language that could constrain the ledger into legalities. The Foundation called again with a softer tone, asking procedural questions that read like veiled ultimatums. The steward proposed the annual reading as a gesture that might satisfy both the public's itch for ritual and the private need for consent. "Bring them," he said to us, "and we will read the names aloud. We will ask if those names want to be kept in this way. If they do, we will continue. If they do not, they will be struck from the page." It seemed to be the only compromise that honored both the lawyer's hunger for form and the steward's hunger for ritual. It was a thin bridge, and I could feel how precarious such bridges are. Rituals can be performed for the wrong reasons. Forms can be used as weapons. Yet the reading felt like a practice worth trying. A yearly reaffirmation of consent, a public yet humble act. But ritual needs participants. The first time we announced the plan, the town folded slightly inward with curiosity. Some came because they had been helped and wanted to be acknowledged. Others came because they were intrigued by the possibility of watching private tenderness made public. Mrs. Halverson came with her repaired gloves and a small smile. The printer's apprentice came, though he kept his eyes on the floor. Mrs. Keene arrived with a new stack of paperbacks to sell. The columnist did not attend. She preferred the teeth of the rumor. We prepared the room. Chairs in a modest circle, a teapot polished, cups warming on the windowsill. The ledger lay on a pillow in the center, its leather spined and a little slick with lemon oil. Noah and the steward would read the names. The lawyer would sit and take notes in case a signature was requested afterward. My parents would attend because they wanted to show they were not careless. I would be there because I had learned to see the difference between a photograph's demand and a ledger's kindness. We had not, at that point, decided how to deal with the photographer's prints. They remained in the frames on the mantel, the smear a constant and contentious presence. The photograph had started the town's hunger for an explanation, and in that hunger, small conflicts had been born. The desire to know, the desire to preserve reputation, the desire to see care translated into a form that could be understood by funders and friends alike. The ledger suggested another way, that fidelity is not displayed but maintained. That morning, before the first reading, Noah asked if I would attend his study to help him gather the copies to be spoken aloud. He moved with a careful urgency, a man who knew the value of being measured. The steward hovered and offered advice about the order in which names should be called, a practical worry about the tone of the reading, a desire to make it humane. "Begin with those you have helped most recently," he said. "It keeps the circle tight." It was then, as we arranged little packets wrapped in cloth and tied with the same thin cord the steward used for binding, that I realized the ledger had turned my world sideways. Where I had once measured people by how they performed in public, now I measured them by the quietness of their obligations. Where I once thought a photograph could hold truth, I now understood how 1,000 small acts could. The smear in the photograph had not revealed a crime. It had revealed a question that the town had been too impatient to answer. What do you do when someone is absent from view? By mid-afternoon, the town had begun to show that it could change in small ways. A neighbor who had never left a note brought pie to Mrs. Halverson. A woman from the corner shop sent a bag of flour without asking. No announcements accompanied these gestures. They arrived as soft apologies or as the quiet fulfillment of a ledger's suggestion. The newspaper columnist wrote a follow-up that was less certain than her first piece. She asked whether the ledger's work might be a model for other towns. She posed the idea tentatively, as if admitting this possibility would compromise her attention-grabbing instincts. But not everyone softened. The lawyer still sought concrete assurances. The Foundation's representative still inquired about a public report. A columnist's change of tone is not the same as an entire town's recollection. The smear continued to press, like a finger on a bruise. It demanded explanation. We were learning little by little to answer not with words, but with hands. The ledger had no appetite for demonstration, but it accepted consent. It did not erase the smear. It offered a slow course of action that might eventually make the point the smear had tried and failed to make. That fidelity is built from habit, not trophies. The ledger could not, in a single afternoon, replace every whispered speculation, but it could begin, day after day, to insinuate care into the town's fabric until the fabric strengthened. When evening came, rain again soft against the windows, I sat in the study with a pile of thread and a spool of cord. The green lamp threw a small green pool across the table, and my hands began to move in the rhythm the steward taught. The needle went in. The needle came out. The stitch repeated itself until my palm knew the motion as well as the song of the kettle. Noah sat opposite me. He folded one of the copied letters carefully and set it in a row with others, each a small petition, and each matched by a small act. We were not yet at the point where the town had fully reoriented itself. The Foundation had not been placated. There were still murmurings in the market. The lawyer still prepared forms. The columnist still hovered near a pithy line. But under the green lampshade, in the smell of lemon oil and starch and the soft rustle of paper, a different rhythm was staking a claim. It would not be the end of the story. There were negotiations to come and questions I had not yet asked, and that perhaps I was afraid to ask. For now, however, the ledger kept doing the thing it had always done. It recorded humble pledges and small redeeming acts. It taught me that what looks like hiding from one angle can be practice from another. It taught me that devotion may be a stack of copied letters rather than a public confession. And it taught me most of all that the town's hunger for a tidy narrative could be answered in ways gentler and more sustaining than any scandal could provide. The night closed around the study as if it were a lid. Outside, the murmurs had a kind of ebb. Inside, under the green lampshade, the ledger lay open, its pages a pale geography of names. The steward poured more tea. Noah straightened a thread. I held the needle for a moment, feeling the weight of responsibility as something that could be stitched into the world. I held the needle for a moment, feeling the weight of responsibility as something that could be stitched into the world. The motion steadied me. The needle threaded through cloth like a vow, rehearsed until it cost nothing, and therefore everything. Outside, the rain had softened to a whisper. Inside, the house folded itself around a smaller set of cares. The day of the first reading arrived with an ordinary, stubborn humility. People came in ones and twos, not in the theater-sized crowds the columnist had once dreamed of, but in a steady, sensible stream. Mrs. Halverson carrying a small parcel of sugared biscuits. The printer's apprentice with ink, still on his knuckles, shifting from foot to foot like a boy who had learned to think in deadlines. A neighbor who had only ever exchanged nods with my father, wearing his Sunday coat though it was a Wednesday. The steward arrived early, his coat buttoned to the throat as if armor were a method. Noah carried the ledger as if it were a child, both careful and entirely natural. We made a ring. Chairs were moved so backs faced the window and faces leaned inward. The teapot hissed. Steam wrote small ghosts in the air. When I look back, it is the minor things I remember first. The ledger's leather, darkened in places by lemon oil. The way Noah's hands had a light tremor when he laid the pages on the pillow. The steward's slow breath, which seemed to set the room's tempo. We began with a simple explanation. My father, who had learned to make words feel like stable furniture, read a short paragraph that felt like the middle ground between a press release and a prayer. The lawyer sat to one side with an envelope of forms folded flat. His presence gave the room a cautious confidence. The steward drew a single long breath and said plainly, "We will read names. We will ask if those named consent to be kept in this ledger. If they do, we continue. If they do not, their names come out." It was not a dramatic declaration. It was the exact opposite, a precise procedural kindness. It invited people to step forward if they wanted, and it gave another option for those who did not. The first name called was for a woman who had been helped through a long winter, Mrs. Halverson's neighbor, whose gloves had been mended and whose cupboards had been filled in small, secret ways. She stood as the steward read, and she said simply, "Yes." Her voice was small but sure. It felt in that chair like an affirmation of being known and being protected. The steward read a name for a young man whose rent had been late that spring. He did not come, but his sister did. She came with a wrapped loaf and with eyes that watched the room as if it were a harbor. She too said yes. Some names were read with no one present. A small card had been left on a kitchen table. A line of script. "Please include my mother. She would have wanted this. No fanfare." Those names were accepted with the same care as the ones claimed aloud. When a name was refused, a man we had once helped who had grown embarrassed by assistance and who asked to be removed from the page, the steward lifted a hand and the ledger closed like a book being laid down with dignity. We struck the name with ink and a short motion that felt less like erasure than release. Noah then burned the duplicate copy the way the steward had taught him, the flame taking the paper with a gentle, necessary violence that felt as if absolution had a sound, a small rush, a quiet popping. The act was procedural and, in its way, tender. The lawyer watched closely and then nodded. He wrote a short clause that allowed removal upon request. He called it a revocation clause and folded it into the stack of papers he kept. If this was a bridge between law and ritual, it was a footbridge. Narrow, maybe, but able to hold weight. When asked later why he had agreed to such a limited, almost informal set of measures, he answered without flourish. "Law can protect, but it can also ossify. This way people remain in control of being known." After the reading, the steward proposed a yearly hour. We set a date, late autumn when leaves are tired and the town is less crowded. He suggested names be read in no particular order, so the ritual would not become performance. "If people want ceremony," he said, "let them bring their own. This ceremony is for consent." The suggestion landed like an oath. The foundation called that afternoon. Their voice was polite, the edges softened. They wanted to know the mechanics. Could the ledger be audited? Would there be a public report? My parents answered as parents do when the world asks for certainty. They promised a summary of actions, an overview that would not name people without permission. The foundation hesitated. It is not that they did not like modesty. It is that institutions prefer boxes to breath. In the end, they offered a conditional pledge. Money that would arrive if certain procedural steps were met. Those steps were not the ledger. They were a map to ensure that funds would reach intended ends. My father signed with hands that still trembled. We had together made a bargain, structure for support. Back in the house, after the visitors left and the chairs were returned to their corners, the ledger remained open on the pillow. There was a strange hush, the kind that follows a communal act. We sat for a while in that hush, as if waiting to see whether the ritual would stick or slough off like moss. It did not stick because someone commanded it to. It stuck because people found it useful. The week after the reading, acts multiplied in ways that were not always visible, but were unmistakable if you knew where to look. A pantry item appeared at Mrs. Halverson's door with a scrap of paper. For the Tuesday stew. A child's coat, sewn at the elbow, showed up on a hook without fanfare. At the bookshop, Mrs. Keene began keeping a small list in the back room of people who could borrow books without paying until they could afford it. The printer's apprentice, who had once wanted to publish the ledger, quietly printed a small card that explained how to make a simple flour paste and distributed it at the market. He wrapped the instructions in the warm satisfaction of learning a craft. The ledger, which had been heavy with a private gravity, began to hum at the edges with a public usefulness. That hum was not a triumphal sound. It was a kind of industrious contentment. Not everything was resolved. The columnist, persistent and sharp, wrote a piece that watched us for a few paragraphs and then, perhaps because she had to make a living from edges, suggested the ledger might mask favoritism. Her suspicion was measured. It looked for patterns that might not exist. The lawyer sighed and drafted a procedure for fairly rotating help should patterns emerge. He insisted on a small committee that would, if asked, review the ledger's processes and report on fairness. The steward bribed him with tea and convinced him to limit the committee to a pair of trusted townspeople and a representative from the house. "Keep it small," the steward said, "or it becomes its own bureaucracy." This negotiation, small, awkward, and necessary, characterized the months that followed. We learned to say no when a sign of generosity could become leverage. We learned to accept simply because we had been asked. We learned, too, the danger of performing charity for applause rather than privacy. The steward reminded us more than once that the line between keeping someone's name and owning it is a fine one, that the ledger's entries must remain invitations rather than inventories. There were tests. A visiting donor once arrived with a camera, wanting portraits to highlight the work being done. We refused. The donor took the refusal with surprising grace. In another test, a man appeared asking for a public accounting of where every donated penny had gone. He said he was a volunteer for a national watchdog group and that transparency needed to mean names. We offered him the summary my father had promised and named the procedures we had adopted. He left still wanting more. Our answers were not foolproof. They were compromises we were willing to keep living with because they gave people agency. The ledger taught me new ways of seeing, little by little. A woman who once sold pickles at the market but had been too proud to accept help began to leave a small jar of jam on Mrs. Halverson's stoop each Wednesday. A teenager, shyer than most, discovered he could earn credit by repairing bicycles for those who needed transport. The town's kindnesses did not aggregate into a single shining moment. They accreted, layer upon layer, until certain winter nights did not feel as sharp. At the center of all this, Noah's habits deepened. He found a rhythm of returning favors in small acts, each of which was both an answer and a question. He would make tea for a widow and ask, "Is this an intrusion?" He would leave a repaired strap on a delivery boy's satchel with a note. "If this helps, place coin in the tin at the corner shop." He taught me that consent looks like invitation, but also like a readiness to step back. There was an economy in humility. Sometimes, though, I still felt a pull toward wanting a tidy narrative. Our human brains crave arcs. The smear, the reveal, the resolution. I found it hard to resist imagining a day when the ledger would be praised in the column's bold type as a new civic model. That would have been satisfying in a very particular, shallow way. It would have made the ledger into a trophy, and trophies are brittle. We purposely avoided that. We refused interviews and refused to let the ledger be put on a pedestal. We wanted the work to be ordinary. We learned, too, how small errors could become stories. A misdelivered note once read, "Keep me," instead of "leave me." And for a week, a conversation spiraled about obligations misread. We corrected it. The steward called the person who had written the note, offered an apology, and the person laughed in a way that indicated forgiveness rather than embarrassment. Such things happened. They were messy and human. They taught us that mistakes were part of living, and that the ledger, like any practice, required gentleness toward failure. Months folded into a year. The second reading took place in the same late autumn light, and we found fewer newcomers and more regulars. Names were added and names withdrawn. The steward suggested a small change in procedure. When a request was copied into the ledger, it would now include, where possible, a suggested method of fulfillment and a note about whether public acknowledgement was welcome. It was a small adaptation born of conversation and the lived experience of the first cycle. The steward remained a moral center. One evening, when the lawyer returned with a new set of clauses meant to tighten protections, the steward pushed back gently and said, "Law protects things at a distance. Ritual keeps them close. We need both, but neither should be a cage." The lawyer listened and adjusted the language so the clause allowed for flexibility, for human discretion. This human discretion was, in a way, the ledger's secret, that the weight of care lies in judgment as much as in rules. There were moments of private tenderness that I could not have anticipated. Once, a young mother came to the study with a small child asleep across her arms. She had been ashamed to ask for help. It took her 2 tries to stand at the threshold. Noah met her with a kettle and a steady chair. He showed her a copied note from the ledger, an entry someone had made on a day the mother said she had been too tired even to write. And then he offered a simple plan, a bag of essentials left weekly, quietly, and an invitation to come to the reading if she wished. She came once, and then not at all. The ledger had been enough. The house, too, was changed in ways that were delicate. My parents relaxed in small measures. My mother stopped smoothing her hands in public the way a conductor smooths sheet music. My father, who had always catalogued things, learned to accept that not everything could be itemized with a clean line. He kept a different ledger now, a private list of moments, an afternoon when a neighbor repaired our fence, a morning when someone swept the walk for my mother. His ledger was less legal and more sentimental. When the foundation sent a representative to inspect the procedural steps, they were surprised to find a room that smelled of lemon oil and paste, not of polished press releases. They asked for the summary of acts, and the steward explained the reading ritual. The representative, a careful woman, listened and wrote notes. She asked whether the ledger could be part of a pilot program to encourage similar practices in other towns. The steward smiled a slow, cautious smile and said, "If it is done with respect for privacy, perhaps." It was not a commitment, it was a guarded opening. The printer's apprentice became a small instrument of steady change. He printed small cards that taught how to fold letters and how to make paste. He set up a tiny stall at the market where people could learn to sew a button for a small fee, enough to keep him employed and enough to make the service modestly priced. In doing so, he translated the ledger's ethic into a practical trade. Keep what you can, trade when you must, ask when help is needed. One night, much later, after a season of storms, I found a photograph in the attic, one of the original prints from the studio. The smear was there, steady as an old bruise. I took it down to Noah's study, where the green lamp threw its familiar light. He did not flinch. He took the photograph and with a soft motion set it against the ledger as if to let the 2 objects regard one another. "It is still odd," he said quietly, "but I have stopped needing the town to fix it." That afternoon I asked him again, in a way I had asked in an earlier frightened week. If the smear had been clearer, that is to say, if there had been something to expose, would you have kept doing what you do? He looked up from the ledger and shook his head gently. "It is not about keeping secrets," he said. "It is about making sure that being known is not dangerous. I would keep doing it because people need to be held, not boxed." He explained, in a way I could finally hear, that the smear had been useful in one unexpected manner. It had made visible the town's hunger for clean stories, and that hunger had forced us to create a practice that was resistant to neatness. The smear had named our weakness, and the ledger had been our answer. The scandal the town wanted had been refused. In its place, a practice had taken root. There was a moment of embarrassment, small but sharp, when the lawyer found that a clause he had drafted had used language that sounded like ownership. Guardian, it read, where we preferred steward. We corrected it at once. Language mattered. The steward insisted that we use words that implied temporal care rather than possession. There is no permanence in being kept, he reminded us. There is only practice. In the quiet that followed another winter, community rituals began to mimic what we had made. At the chapel, a group organized a bread clock, neighbors who pledged to leave fresh loaves for those who could not buy them on certain days. The bookshop instituted an anonymous exchange table where people could leave books for neighbors in need. The bakery, perhaps the most public of the market's faces, put up a small box where people could drop coins for a soup fund for anyone who asked. None of these were orchestrated by us. They came as echoes, small infractions of habit that became habit themselves. Not everyone took kindly to the shift away from spectacle. Some still looked at the photo on our mantel as if it were a riddle needing solution. Some preferred the bright, sharp arc of gossip to the slow, quiet work of care. And that, in a way, was fine. The town is always a mixture of appetites. But the fact that the ledger continued to be used year after year suggested something, that modesty can be durable. There were also moments when the ledger confronted its own limits. An elderly man, who had been a beneficiary of our small economy for years, began to ask for things that the ledger and our neighbors could not provide. Expensive medical equipment, complex legal aid. We had to be honest about boundaries. The steward and the lawyer worked to map referrals to other services. We helped to the extent of our ability and did not pretend to be more. That humility preserved us. I learned, beneath the green lamp and under the steward's patient tutelage, that fidelity is not a single shining proof. It is not a photograph, however well produced. It is the dull, repeated motion of a needle. It is the act of boiling sugar so jam will keep. It is the patient mending of a heel so a child can walk to school. It is the ritual of reading names, then listening for an answer. On a day years after the smear, when the town was less inquisitive and more used to the ledger's modest presence, a new family moved into the row of houses behind ours. They were young and spoke differently, carrying the sort of startled energy that comes with fresh starts. One evening, their child cried at the supper table because the boots were too tight. The parents, a little embarrassed, asked if there was any help. Noah left a note at their door the next morning with a suggestion to meet at dawn. He asked if they wanted the help spoken of publicly. They laughed, surprised at the question, and said they preferred to decline any fuss. The ledger took their request as it always had, gentle, practical, and invisible to those who were not involved. It felt in that small exchange as though we had moved from a place of defense, defending ourselves from a smear, to a place of practice. The smear no longer set the terms. The terms were now daily habits of tending. I keep returning to the photograph, though. It sits framed and does not command the room the way it once did. Sometimes when the late light hits the glass, the smear throws a shadow that looks like a line of longitude across Noah's face. Once, when I looked at it closely, I thought I could see in the absence of eyes a question rather than an accusation. Who will hold this person if not us? The ledger had become the answer to that unspoken question. Toward the end of my telling, there are still particulars to settle. The foundation continues with its conditional support. The lawyer keeps his forms updated. The steward grows older, not less steady. Noah spends more time in the study, and sometimes he brings me a cup of tea without asking if I prefer milk. These are small intimacies that map the terrain of trust. There were nights, late and unremarkable, when I would sit alone with the ledger open and try to imagine the sum of what it contained. I would try to count acts, which is foolish because care resists enumeration. Instead, I would close the book and place my hand on its leather and consider fidelity as a possibility rather than a guarantee. The ledger taught me to see a life as a series of opportunities to care, each one separate and also conjoined. It taught me that the absence of proof is not the proof of absence, that a missing face in a photograph is not necessarily a hidden life, but can be the town's demand for explanation. People often ask what the shocking truth was. I have learned to answer them as Noah did, with deeds rather than declarations. The shock, such as it was not that Noah hid something nefarious. The shock, if shock is the right word, was in the realization that most of us want tidy stories, and that those tidy stories often flatten the messy, generous work of keeping another person. The true surprise lay in discovering an ethic of care that refused to be dramatic. We found that a ledger, a needle, a duplicated letter burned on a tin in the sink. These were the instruments of devotion. If the title of this little account has pulled you in with a question, is he hiding something? I hope the answer I've given feels less like a denouement and more like an invitation. The real revelation is not Noah at all, but what a community does when faced with a single, weird absence. The photograph did not reveal a crime. It revealed our hunger for stories. The ledger then guided us, step by small step, toward a daily practice that resisted spectacle. There is a closing moment I keep with me. A winter morning, the house lit with low sun, steam from kettles rising like small pillars. A neighbor came by with a wrapped parcel and left it on the steps without knocking. Inside was a mended coat and a note. "Keep warm, from a friend." No name, no article in the paper, no photograph. Just a small act. Noah saw it and smiled in a way that had nothing theatrical about it. It was private, and it was enough. If you have read this far and you feel some small stirring, some thought that perhaps the ways we keep one another are larger than the images we make, then I will make one request. Choose one small thing you can do this week to keep someone's name. A meal left at a door, a phone call at an agreed time, a repair you can make, or a book you can pass along. Do it without announcement if you can. Then share it below. Write the small act you will commit to and a single line about why it matters. If you prefer privacy, you may simply hold it as a quiet vow. The photograph still sits on the mantel. The smear remains. It no longer commands the town's appetite. Instead, it acts like a prompt, a question that pushes for attention, not spectacle. The ledger remains on the pillow in the study, pages now worn in a new, softer way. Noah keeps tending. The steward keeps teaching. The lawyer keeps reminding us of limits. The town keeps waking up, little by little, to the labor of keeping. Fidelity, I have learned, is not proven in a single exposure. It is shown in the persistence of hands. It is the patience of a needle and the obligation renewed each year when names are read and consent is asked again. It is the refusal to let a smear become a verdict. So when someone asks, perhaps even now, as you look at this story and picture a smear somewhere in a picture, remember that the truly shocking thing would be if, faced with absence, we did nothing. The real revelation is that there are people who will choose the hard, gentle work of tending instead. They do it without headline and sometimes without thanks. They do it because being known must be safe. We keep the photograph, and by keeping it, we remember what provoked us. We keep the ledger, and by keeping it, we remember how we chose to answer. The two objects hang together in the house like a question and an answer. The question will always be part of our history. The answer keeps being made. If you are willing, tell us below the small thing you will do this week to keep someone's name. Share it. Let the ledger be, in this small corner of the world, a multiplying practice. The needle rests by the sink. The lemon oil sits on the shelf. The green lampshade burns its slow green light into the evening. Outside, the town goes on with its appetites and its quietness. Inside, we continue to stitch.